Hi, welcome to Hub Bites. I'm Sanil Rege, consultant psychiatrist. Today I'll be talking about 2 things that you should do if you want to be really successful. Well, at whatever you want to be successful at. This is not a clickbait video, so I'm going to give you those 2 things straight away, so you don't have to wait right at the end. The 2 things are repetition and delayed gratification. But let me explain why those 2 things are necessary for your path to success. Now, as a psychiatrist, I basically deal with human behavior. I see so many people from whom I can learn so many things from. And when I think about individuals, I of course think from their biological perspective, their psychological perspective, social, cultural, their diet, their lifestyle, etc. Their cognitions, the way they think. And what I'm trying to do here is to, of course, bring all of that together and give you sort of a nutshell as to why repetition and delayed gratification are 2 things that can really help someone become successful. So without further ado, let's jump into it. See, William James first talked about short-term memory, and he said that when we learn something initially, a lot of the short-term memory aspects primarily take place in this frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex. And you might know that I talk a lot about frontal lobe and limbic system, etc. So very similar concepts apply here. So short-term memory, when we're learning something, the frontal lobe is really engaged and working hard. And then what happens is the information, when it's taken in the frontal lobe, then makes a stopover in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the important memory area of the brain. Interestingly, it's the same area of the brain that initially starts being affected in Alzheimer's disease when we start losing those memories. So we will talk more about the kinds of memories that are in the different parts of the brain. Now, why is repetition so important? You see, whenever we want to learn something, like I said, initially the frontal lobe's working really hard. It's getting all that information. It's learning those nitty-gritty little steps that you want to take in order to complete a task. But then repetition is one of the only ways in which you can transfer that information from that frontal lobe and push it back towards those key areas of the brain that are necessary for things to come naturally or for you to do those things on autopilot. Repetition creates long-term memory by eliciting or enacting strong chemical interactions at the synapse of your neurons, and essentially also where neurons connect to other neurons. So you get this really nice snowball effect through repetition where the whole brain's sort of firing. And repetition creates the strongest learning and most learning as well of 2 types. The explicit memory, also known as declarative memory, and the implicit memory, also known as procedural memory. So just to give you that recap again, frontal lobe, push it back towards the backside areas of the brain where those long-term memories are going to be stored. And explicit memory is the declarative memory, the sort of memory that you recall. So for example, when you're rote learning and you want to bring it up when you're doing the exam, that's sort of these explicit memory, the semantic, the knowledge, the meaning of words, names, numbers, etc. Implicit memory is, for example, when you wake up in the morning, you're tying your shoelaces, you don't even have to think about it. You get in your car, you drive to work, you don't even think about the brake, the accelerator, the gears that you change, none of that. It's all there in your implicit procedural memory. Why? Because you've done it 1,000 times, repetition. So repetition is absolutely crucial for the formation of these long-term memories. The specific parts of the brain, explicit memory, relies on the hippocampus, the neocortex, and the amygdala. Whilst implicit memories, the motor memories that I talked about, of course the hippocampus has it, but the other parts of the brain that really come into the fore are the motor parts, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum. Now, you might say at this point, well, repetition is the same as habit. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It is linked to habit. And we know that habit, in a way, has been described in many books. So James Clear recently wrote a bestseller, Atomic Habits. Malcolm Gladwell talked about 10,000 magic number in his book Outliers. So it's a common saying that in order to master a new skill, it takes 10,000 hours of practice. That was what Malcolm Gladwell said in his 2008 book, Outliers, The Story of Success. But he cites it as a magic number. Of course, it's been disproven that there isn't a magic number as such, but the certainty that we have is that when it comes to making a habit, whether it's learning a guitar, learning to skate, learning to ski, tennis, or running a business and doing those tasks day-to-day basis, there's no substitute for repetition. Now, habit-making behaviors, let's think about what's further happening in the brain. Now, habit-making behaviors, I mentioned, they are linked to part of the brain, which is basal ganglia. Now, basal ganglia has connections to the frontal lobe. Now, basal ganglia are the same areas that are affected in Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, etc. Some of the basal ganglia areas include caudate, putamen, substantia nigra, subthalamic nucleus. So think about it, these are all these areas that are required for smooth movements, but importantly, they connect to that frontal lobe. They're known as the frontal subcortical circuits. And these circuits are very much lubricated by dopamine. And we'll come to that later on. So basal ganglia, which is situated at the base of the forebrain, is strongly connected with a number of other areas. As habit creation or repetition is an automatic process, you see, when you've done it so many times, it's pushed to the back and therefore requires less brain power. And what you've done through that is you've freed up space in the front part of the brain to take on analysis, enhanced decision-making, advanced decision-making, advanced learning. So think about your brain as a computer. When you first started learning, all of that information's here. You repeat the habit over and over and over again. You've pushed it back, space is freed up in the front part of the brain, and you can add on the analysis section. You can add on the decision-making process, error detection. How do I change things? How do I set shift? How can I do things better? Because the analysis is what will really hone your skill sets, detect errors, risk management, all of those things become important. So you have created space to take on new things. Now, once you become aware of this, it becomes a lot more easier to change your habits or take on new habits. So there is something known as the habit loop. What is this habit loop? The first one is the cue. The cue kicks your brain into an automatic mode and says it's the heuristics. It basically says, okay, this is the repetition habit that I can use for this particular problem-solving tool. Cue kicks your brain into the habit because you've done it so many times, it knows immediately. The implicit memory kicks in and you get that tool. The next part is the routine. So this is the routine that you'll put into place to do that repeatedly. And finally, as a result, the reward that comes with it. This reward is important and it's linked to intrinsic motivation. Why? Because if you actually don't enjoy that task, in other words, what is enjoyment? Receiving that dopamine, that positive reinforcement, you are unlikely to continue with this repetitive loop. So it's really important to do things that you're passionate about. So at this point, when we think about this reward loop, cue the routine, but you need that intrinsic motivation. You need that dopamine for positive reinforcement, the reward at various stages. And I'll come to this later on because that's where the delayed gratification becomes very important. Here you might ask the question, but what if I keep doing something and it's wrong? Now, of course, we know in the initial stages, this is why we say, try different things to find out what you're passionate about. But it's important to keep trying things and making it a habit so that the frontal lobe can then evaluate whether it's something you enjoy or don't enjoy. And that's the decision making and analysis before you say, okay, you know what? That's not helpful. I'm going to let that go. I'm going to try something new. So it is a process, but you're more likely to succeed if you stick with it. That's why they say stick with it for a while and then figure out whether that's something you're passionate about. So to summarize here, in simple words, what you're looking to do, initial frontal lobe, push everything back towards those key areas of the brain, implicit memory, explicit memory, free up space in your brain for analysis, decision-making, and frontal lobe also includes dopamine to know whether it's pleasurable or not. Because if it's stressful, then it means that your frontal lobe's engaged too much because the cognitive energy is too much. So rehearsal, repetition of the simple task over and over again. Now, interestingly, this is the same concept. So we talked about Malcolm Gladwell in Outliers, talked about this, 10,000 hours, right, to acquire a skill, but it's not a magic number. Atomic Habits, James Clear talks about it. Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, talked about in the context of businesses. And he used the term, the hedgehog concept. And he talked about passion, capability, and results. Passion is that drive, that intrinsic motivation. Capability, what are we good at? And results is the positive reinforcement, the dopamine that we get to maintain, keep doing that loop over and over again. And what he said, he called on companies to identify the core value proposition. What are we good at? What are the things that we do well and keep doing those things really well? So basically the hedgehog concept is, he said the fox knows many things. Fox is really smart. It's a predator that can gain a meal in many, many different ways, but the hedgehog knows one thing only. And the fox cannot get to the hedgehog because the hedgehog can protect itself by doing the same thing over and over again, obviously curling up and preventing the fox from making it a meal. So it does the same thing repeatedly, and that's its secret of success. So that's what he talked about, the hedgehog concept, in his book, Good to Great. So you can see not only from a personal perspective it's applicable, it's also applicable to businesses and what you do. If you're looking to learn more about this topic and discover a range of other stimulating psychiatry courses, then don't forget to subscribe to the Academy by PsychScene. It also talked about the flywheel. So after a point you reach, when you do the same thing over and over again, you reach what's called an inflection point. Flywheel keeps going over in a flow state. When our brain is repeating a habit, the feeling of what's called running on autopilot, we sometimes call it as comes naturally to me. Those are some of the words that we use. It doesn't need to use much energy, as I said, because we're not engaging so much the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex can then be used for higher level skills like paying sustained attention to difficult tasks or decision making or analysis. I mentioned that. Aristotle said the same thing. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit, right? Exactly the same thing. This concept is also described by the psychologist. It's a tough name for me to pronounce, but it's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Apologies if I've got that wrong, but he talked about the state of flow. And it's the same thing. It's the state of flow where you just feel as if you're doing things with ease. Now, let me take you to these concepts described by athletes because they're written in different books in different ways, but it's the same concept. It comes down to understanding the role of the frontal lobe, understanding the role of this procedural memory, the power of repetition, and then utilizing that to give us that extra edge in a way. Now, let me take you to the field of climbing. And you might have seen the documentary where Alex Honnold, free climber, absolutely brilliant. And he says that he is searching for the feeling of effortlessness. When we're actually watching him climb, it's scary, but I would think that there is so much effort going into thinking about each of those things. But what he says is this: when climbing feels good, when it feels effortless, when it feels flowy. So the same flow concept described by Csikszentmihalyi. That's flow state, he says. And that is the appeal of climbing in a lot of ways, is to get into that state, to feel like you're doing something well and that you're performing well. Now, Stephen Kotler described the same sort of flow state in Super Performance Athletes. So similar concept, again, put into different terminology or book. Now, I'll come to another concept, which is exactly the same. And I'll cover this in another video, but the book Ikigai talks about exactly this. And Ikigai is nothing but the purpose or the meaning to live. And when you think about the Ikigai circle, it's exactly the same. It's a combination where what you're good at, what can you provide the world, etc., all comes together and provides you with this flow state where you love getting up in the morning and doing what you love doing. So being in that flow state. Of course, it takes a while to come to that state. What's necessary is that passion and that repetition. But repetition comes first, because the only way you know whether you're going to get that passion is by repeating a task and becoming good at it, because when you start getting good at something, that's where the reward comes in, dopamine flows in, and you get that positive reinforcement. That's repetition, the first important step for success. Repetition, link to habit, focus on the process, the outcomes, the reward, which will maintain that habit loop or the reward loop. The second component for success, the second secret, if you want, is delayed gratification. Most of the times people talk about the process, they talk about, do things repeatedly and become better. Yes, we've just talked about it, but delayed gratification is crucial. Now, the classic experiment testing the persistence of delay of gratification or delayed gratification is Walter Mischel's 1972 marshmallow test. Now, let me explain firstly from a neurobiological perspective dopamine first, because in order for us to understand this, we have to understand the neurobiology of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that really is linked to reward, it's linked to motivation, it's linked to drive, it's linked to pleasure, it's also linked to movement. So all of these things come together. But we have two types of dopamine release in the brain. One is the pulsatile, as you can see there. It's the pulsatile release that occurs in, say, for example, if I use a maladaptive way, drug addiction. The first time we really like something, that's a pulsatile release. Gambling, internet addiction, that's pulsatile, and it's the basis of addictive behavior. It's short, sharp, at different pulses. We can crave for the next hit, the next pulse. But the kind of dopamine that we want for success is actually the rhythmic dopamine. The rhythmic dopamine is what maintains that flow state. It's what allows us to really enjoy that task over an extended period. So what we're trying to do is not want immediate gratification from a neurobiological perspective, but something that maintains that flow state over an extended period, i.e. rhythmic dopamine. So let's come back to the marshmallow test. Essentially, this was basically 4 to 5-year-old kids. The researcher places a marshmallow in front of the kid. There are two options for the child. The kid can get one marshmallow now and they can eat it. Or if they wait 15 minutes, they get 2. Simple proposition. 1 treat right now or 2 treats later. And when they actually compared the children's delay times and correlated this to the SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, 10 years later, they found that longer delay times significantly correlated with higher SAT scores with Scholastic Aptitude, which measures a number of things, okay? But you might say, okay, that's academic, but it's a really powerful finding. And the finding that suggested that those who could delay their gratification or to receive a high value reward when they were young retained this tendency even later during adulthood. And interestingly, the children who were able to delay gratification and waited to receive the second marshmallow not only received higher SAT scores, but they also had lower levels of substance use later in adulthood, lower likelihood of obesity, better responses to stress, better social skills as reported by their parents, and generally better scores in a range of other life measures. Furthermore, they followed each child for more than 40 years. Over and over again, what they found was the group who waited patiently for that second marshmallow succeeded in whatever capacity they measured. So really, really fascinating. So really what you want to do, try to focus on obtaining that rhythmic dopamine rather than the pulsatile dopamine, to try to enter into that flow state and recognizing that importance of delayed gratification. Often what happens is we do something, we expect gratification, and if we don't get it, we let go of it. We want to wait. Thus, one might say that the key to success in a way is the ability, and when I specifically talk about the delayed gratification, is for the prefrontal cortex to effectively exercise control over the limbic reward pathway, which is a primitive pathway. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And that primitive reward pathway also includes the striatum. So this is the nucleus accumbens, the striatum, all the reward pathways that are involved in addiction. So let me give you practical examples. This delayed gratification is seen in long-term investing. Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger talk about the importance of long-term investing as compared to trading. Of course, many people can be successful in trading, but we know a small percentage do. And that's based on the principle of immediate gratification, can be addictive as well. Gambling can be problematic. So long-term investing is one example. Second, mountaineering. The amount of time that it takes to reach that mountain, the practice that it requires. Athletes, take medical school. Medical school is a lot about delayed gratification. They're sacrificing a lot of things in the initial stages to be able to receive some gratification much later on. I'm sure so many other ways. Think about businesses. We only know Amazon is a great example. Jeff Bezos, many years unknown. There is a saying that people often think about successful organizations as overnight successes, but they forget the amount of time that it's taken to get there. 10, 20 years. That's the delayed gratification. Now, I want to bring all of this together by giving you the example of a speed skater. And Nils van der Poel wrote this manual just after winning the Winter Olympic gold. I think he won it in 2 events, but he also broke the world record in speed skating. And his manual is called How to Skate 10K and Half a 10K. His manual is really an embodiment of repetition and delayed gratification. And there's no better way of describing it. And I'm going to use his verbatim statements to highlight exactly this. Repetition and delayed gratification. He says, I suppose that I've made myself clear about the fact that one becomes good at whatever it is that one practices. Habit, repetition. True self-confidence comes from experience. I wasn't mentally strong as a kid. I hated to compete ever since I started speed skating. I truly hated it. It is still a little anxiety provoking for me. I think it will always be when I test myself in an activity that I really care about. But today it's a walk in the park compared to when I was a kid. And this is important. The development was mainly acquired through continuous voluntary confrontation with the challenge. And he says, read that sentence again, an emphasis voluntary. It was first when I understood that or felt like I volunteered that I was able to compete with a free mind. It's alluding to that flow state, the desire to want to do something, obviously the habit and doing it and not liking it. So really fascinating. The importance of continuous voluntary confrontation. He then says, one of the challenges of this program, and the program's described in detail, is that it's very monotonous. At first I was worried that if I always did the same sessions, my body would eventually stop reacting to the stimulus. In my experience, this was not the case. Maybe this was because I used different training sessions. But 3 interesting and advantageous phenomena occurred thanks to the monotonous programs. Now I'll cover some of those ones that he talked about. He says, I became very good at performing the high intensity sessions. When I repeated the same sessions over and over again, I learned how much I could push it on the first, the second, the third set in order to still complete the entire session at a good pace without having to increase or decrease the intensity towards the end of the session. So note what's happening through that monotonous aspect. One's able to use that extra analysis because the freed up prefrontal cortex, the computer space in the hardware. Then the monotonous program exposed me to those sessions so often that they became very familiar mentally. As I repeated them over and over again, the anxiety level dropped. So note what's happening. The anxiety aspect drops as a result of repetition as well. And a few weeks into the training session, I was totally unconcerned about tomorrow's session as I went to bed. Monotony, repetition, habit, what we can see here is that the analysis comes in, the relief of anxiety, and note what's the relief of anxiety. One's slowly entering into flow states as a result of that. The one that Honnold described, effortless, right? So he's entering slowly into flow state. The monotonous program made me see improvement very easily. The extra analysis, decision-making, etc. Then he says, talks about the lessons. One is that nothing is achieved without a sacrifice, the delayed gratification. And another one would be that it doesn't require that much strength nor explosiveness to skate 25 laps of 30 seconds. So what's interesting there is what he realized through repetition is that what he was doing was actually effortless. So entering into that flow state, just phenomenal. He then says, to me, speed skating was just a one-legged squat, repeated over and over during maximum heart rate. It was all just very simple and I kept it that way. comes down really just to that repetition, and he talks beautifully about entering that flow state. Then let's look at a bit more. When I was 18 years old, I was going purely on autopilot. So he's really gone into that repetitive, implicit memory easily. He's already got that. A few years later, I accepted that my motivation is not infinite, rather finite. Now note where we're coming into the dopamine aspects. Some efforts help me approach my goals very rapidly, whilst other efforts also helping me fulfill my goals did it a lot slower and not as efficiently. Some of these actions inspired me to take on even harder challenges. They increased my motivation. Now note what's happening. He was an autopilot, the implicit memory, but wants that extra dopamine to set that loop that we talked about, that habit loop. Because without reward and dopamine, which is that motivation, it's difficult to keep that flow state, the rhythmic dopamine. And he says, but some of them drain me of my motivation instead. My entire training program was predicated on a foundation of inner motivation. If it ran out, I could no longer keep up the hard work. So note, hard work, if it's enjoyable, you enter flow state, you're more likely to be there. The hardest thing about this program was getting through it with a smile upon my face. When I found ways to enjoy it, I was unstoppable. Sometimes to get through more hours, what was needed was an ice cream. And sometimes it was multiple ice creams. And in some cases, this ice cream is literally food limbic system dopamine. So that was the positive reinforcement through that extra release of dopamine. Of course, other neurotransmitters likely to come in here as well. The good news was that ice cream was pretty cheap. So even though other skaters had millions of euros going into their careers, I was able to skate faster than all of them because I had found a way to enhance my performance with ice cream. So really, if you think about it, try to find something that gives you that positive reinforcement, that dopamine. And it doesn't have to be expensive. It just has to be something that you enjoy. You pair it together. It's that classical conditioning that Pavlov talked about. Also, operant conditioning comes in, that positive reinforcement subsequently. To me, the challenge was not about suffering, but finding a way to endure hardships with ease, a classical description of the flow state. So therefore, if we just bring it all together, there's not much more to say, but two things that can really help with success are: one, repetition, call it habit, use that repetition to enter into a flow state by finding the inner motivation, that dopamine. And then bear in mind that that dopamine, that flow state, needs the awareness of delayed gratification, the ability to sacrifice, the ability to recognize that some of that dopamine flow state will come later. So there you go. Repetition and delayed gratification. Two really, really powerful elements on the journey to success. I hope that you found this video useful. Of course, if you've got any thoughts, please put them down in the comments section. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know if you want a few other themes like this from a neurobiological perspective. I'd love to do them. Take care and stay safe. Bye-bye. Synthesizing complex material in psychiatry to simplify your practice.